across America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Tuesday edition of Point of View, and today, as we mentioned yesterday, going to talk about space. We're going to talk about rockets. We're going to talk about satellites. We're going to talk about space exploration. We're going to point you to the Day 4 website, also to an astronomy day taking place at the Wonder Center. So a lot of things we're going to try to cover in this first hour, and our good friend Parker Eng, who is the president and founder of Day 4, is with us. And if nothing else, we're going to try to cover some things that people have heard about, but we haven't really talked about here on Point of View. So I'm so grateful you joined us today.
Thank you, Kirby. Yeah, I'm excited. This is going to be a fun topic we're going to talk about today.
We will get into what Day 4 is, although we've talked about it before. We have a link to that as well. Yesterday, of course, we talked about the Discovery Institute conference that is taking place this weekend. There's going to be a astronomy day at the Wonder Center. That's near Nashville, so we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But Parker, one of the reasons I did this is we were planning on, and still planning on, Artemis 2 launching. It's been moved back, but I thought it would be good to give some history for some individuals because we are going back to the moon. But the last time an astronaut lifted his foot off the moon's surface was December 14th, 1972. So for our younger listeners, they can't even imagine what it's like to go to the moon and have somebody actually on the surface of the moon. And so I thought maybe give us a little bit of history.
Yeah, for sure. Apollo 17, Eugene Cernan was the last person to be on the moon and lift his foot off the moon on December 14th. It was actually just after midnight, and that was the last time we were there, last time any human was on the moon. And, of course, we had the Apollo program back then, and now we've got the Artemis program. And for those of you who don't know where the names came from, Apollo, of course, was in Greek mythology, and Apollo's twin sister was Artemis, and so that's why they named this current mission series the Artemis program. And so, the Apollo missions. We had Apollo 8 that went around the moon, did not land on the moon, but of course Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and then we had Apollo 12. 13, for those younger folks who don't know, didn't make it to the moon because there was an incident that happened during flight as they were headed towards the moon, and they had to slingshot back around the moon to come back to Earth. But thankfully, those astronauts made it back safely. But then 14, 15, 16, and 17, and 16, last year, actually 2 years ago now, during the total solar eclipse that came through the United States, we had Charlie Duke, astronaut Charlie Duke, with us, who was on Apollo 16. But yeah, I mean, I love space. I love our space program. I've had opportunities to go to NASA myself and to Kennedy Space Center, and matter of fact, I got to go to the very last launch of all the space shuttles. Space Shuttle Atlantis STS-135 with my good buddy Scott O'Grady,
yes.
Who was the Air Force pilot that got shot down over Bosnia back in 1995. Some of you guys may know his name, but we got to go and get a private tour of NASA the day before the launch and got to see the launch on the day of. And what a blessing it's been to be able to witness all that over the years.
And I might just mention, I was going to talk about the fact that you've been on tours that other people have been on through the various places where NASA offers tours, but you've also gotten to have some inside tours there as well, and that's been a great opportunity. But, you think of Star Trek, the space, the final frontier, or from a biblical point of view, certainly in the Old Testament, in Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and we're going to get back to that in just a minute. But Since you're talking about Apollo, let's talk about Artemis. We've had an Artemis 1 that was launched and did a flyby, but we've been waiting for the launch of Artemis 2, and I was with you the other day when you had a Day 4 event talking about, well, maybe it's going to happen in March, and now it's gotten pushed back, which we're going to get to in just a minute because we have some articles about whether or not we might need an overhaul of space exploration. But what is coming up? We did this, plan this originally because we thought, well, just a few weeks from now, we're going to have a launch of Artemis 2, yet I don't think many people know we're going to the moon again.
Yeah, it was. It's been crazy. You know, when I talk about Artemis to different folks and speak at different events, it's amazing to me how many people didn't even know that Artemis 1 launched.
Yes,
and that we sent that up there as our first test flight around the moon in forever since 1972, basically, and they didn't even know that we did that, and they don't even know that we've got Artemis 2 getting ready to send people back towards the moon. Of course, Artemis 3 right now is scheduled to launch in 2028. And that's when we'll actually put humans back on the moon.
So again, just some incredible material here. As we go through this, let me just mention that a little bit later we're going to talk about the fact that Elon Musk wants to put 1 million satellites in low orbit. That's with SpaceX. You have Jeff Bezos, of course, who has Blue Origin. There's all these jokes about, when these people become billionaires, they're like 5-year-old kids. I'm going to build myself a rocket and go to outer space. But when Artemis 2 is launched, if I have this right, Reed Weissman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, as well as Jeremy Hansen are the 4 people in the crew. Is that right?
Yeah, Artemis 2 has 4 astronauts that will be heading towards the moon. And, of course, again, this mission, they're not going to land on the moon. They're going to fly around the moon. The closest they'll get is about 80 miles from the surface, but they will be doing all kinds of tests and checks and making sure that everything is prepped and ready for Artemis 3 when they actually put folks back on the moon. I'm excited because we do have at least one of those astronauts is a very, very devout Christian, very strong, and Victor Glover, the African-American astronaut on this mission, he flew some missions on the International Space Station.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is while he was on the International Space Station, he worshiped the Lord while he was up there. He sang praise music and songs while he was up there, even to some of the folks down, at Mission Control down in Houston.
And there's a good tradition of that because going all the way back to, I certainly remember Apollo 11 and others reading scripture and the rest. And so we do need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about what is going to happen with NASA. Also, then, we want to talk about what's happening with all of the private space projects, especially one to put, still hard to get my head around this, 1 million satellites around the Earth and what that might mean. And then we're going to talk about, of course, the value of astronomy, how this has become just a great evangelistic opportunity. And if you are not familiar with Day 4, as we go to the break, you can go to day4.org. We have a link there as well. Going to be talking about Astronomy Day. And for those of you that maybe would like to know more about these ideas, we certainly do believe that the heavens do declare the glory of God, and that's why we're doing this program today here on Point of View. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and find a lot of material that we've put together for this conversation. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones to get your comments. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During a hearing in the U.S. House of Representatives, we learned more about potential threats to America, but those threats differed based upon the political party of the member of Congress. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government focused on the influence of Sharia and is chaired by Representative Chip Roy. He also put together a Sharia-free American caucus that now includes 38 members from 18 states. One of the witnesses was Robert Spencer, who has written extensively about the threat from radical Islam. In the hearing, he provided examples of how Sharia policies have been implemented in the UK. In that country, Sharia courts have collided with British judicial system. The response from many of the Democratic members of the subcommittee was to label the discussion unnecessary. Instead, they decided to pivot the discussion to what they believe is a threat to America: Christian nationalism. Representative Brandon Gill cited surveys showing that 39% of Muslims believe that Sharia law should be implemented in this country. He cited another poll that showed the nearly same percentage believe Islam should be declared as the national religion. These statistics were met with snickers from Democrats on the committee. Representative Glenn Grothman said he often interacts with conservative Christian groups in the Midwest and has yet to find one person who is a self-avowed or even an unself-avowed Christian nationalist. He went on to say that Democrats keep talking about these mystery people. This hearing once again illustrates that we may live in the same country, but the members of those political parties live in different worlds. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, privileged to have in studio with us today Parker Eng. He is the president and founder of Day 4. We're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes, but we are at the moment talking about the fact that we've had the Apollo missions. Now we're in the midst of Artemis 2. Soon there will be Artemis 3. And also we'll want to spend some time talking about this issue of satellites, because Elon Musk with SpaceX and Starlink is wanting to put up a lot more satellites than are up there right now. And I think you will begin to understand why as we get into that in just a minute. But Parker, let's at least illustrate the fact that on the solid rocket booster is painted America 250. So again, this idea of the birthday of America, launching a particular spaceship to go around the moon is something we haven't done very often. And this is going to be for a whole new generation of individuals that will be interested in space exploration, might be interested in astronomy, and that's why your ministry actually exists.
Yeah, Day 4 Astronomy is here to show people how the heavens declare the glory of God, as Psalm 19:1 and 2 says. And so we just love talking about all things astronomy, and of course included in astronomy is space exploration. And so, America 250. I'm so excited that they actually put those the painting, the symbol on there on the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, and I heard this for the first time a couple months ago. This is the semi-quincentennial birthday of the United States of America, half of 500, and so that's where the 250 comes from. And SRBs, those are interesting rockets. They're solid rocket boosters, and for those who don't know what that means there's solid fuel inside of them. Unlike the other rocket engines that use liquid hydrogen, liquid helium to burn. The solid rocket boosters, it starts off, and I learned this on my VIP private tour with Scott O'Grady at NASA that time. I learned how they do this. It starts off as a paste, and they coat the inside of the solid rocket cylinders with this paste, and as they're doing it, they're building a shape inside of there. And so the inside center part is actually a star. It's a hollow star, and the reason for that is because the more surface area you have, the stronger the thrust, because there's more surface area to burn. But as that surface area burns, it gets the amount of surface area actually gets less and less, and so your strongest part of the thrust is going to be at liftoff.
Yes,
and actually. When the SLS rocket, and that's it's called the SLS, the Space Launch System, when it launches, the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, actually produce more than 75% of the total thrust.
And that's something.
Yeah, and then the rest of the thrust comes from rocket engines. And so anyway, but as it gets higher and higher, the thrust lessens and lessens because that the surface area lessens.
And they're further away from the gravity and all the rest of it as well. But it's just a fascinating thing. And I know that if people go to your website or want to contact you or have you come and speak, you can go into that in incredible detail. But Artemis 2, maybe going up in April. Is that what our guess is now? Maybe.
That is the current plan. The Artemis rocket was supposed to launch in March. And they had a hydrogen leak in the umbilical. The umbilical is what connects to the rocket and and supplies the fuel into the tank. But they fixed that, and then they did what's called a wet dress rehearsal, and that's when they found the first leak. Then they fixed it. They did a second wet dress rehearsal. Actually, they did 2 on the same day. And counted down to almost T-0. It's where they do everything that it takes except launch, and everything went fine. But then a couple days later, they detected an extra amount of helium up in the upper stage. And that was not something that they could fix on the launch pad, so they actually are rolling it back, to the vehicle assembly building.
Well, again, sometime Artemis 2 is going up, and then, of course, Artemis 3 sometime in 2028, I guess is what they're talking about. But I did want to cover some other issues because we also do want to talk about astronomy, and I do want to open up the phone. So if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But we have seen SpaceX, and this is Elon Musk, putting Starlink satellites into orbit. And originally there were a few, and last time I counted there, I think yours lists here 14,000. But then I just almost fell out of my chair the other day when I heard somebody announce that he wants to put 1 million satellites up in low Earth orbit. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's crazy. So you can go to a website called satellitemap.space, and you can actually see exactly where all the satellites are around our Earth right now, and you can track them. You can click on the actual little dot and find out more information about each satellite, what it's for, who it was made by, and all that fun stuff. But we're already, our skies, our low Earth orbit, it's already polluted with so many satellites. For people like me who love to do astrophotography, it poses a problem because we do long exposures at night, and we get all these streaks in our images, and we have to digitally remove those streaks. But 1 million satellites.
Wow.
Now I understand the reasoning behind it, and it's because computing takes up a lot of energy. It takes up a lot of energy, not just for the computing itself, but the cooling. You have to cool those computers and those data centers. And Elon Musk, his idea is great because you put it in space. Space is cold. You're not spending any money on cooling. You put up a bunch of solar arrays on those satellites, and it's collecting the energy from the sun, and so you're not having to pay for electricity to power the computing. But it's a good idea. Just practically, what are the drawbacks to it?
Let me just mention that one of the articles we've posted, first of all, we have one on the need for a private sector overhaul of the space exploration, which is illustrated by the fact that we keep pushing back the Artemis launch, and I may not get to that today. But the other one I wanted you to see comes from our friends at the Wall Street Journal, The Political Battle for AI in Space. You've heard me say before that AI, artificial intelligence, and AI search, as we understand it right now, takes 10 times as much energy as a Google search. So first of all, you've got to start doing the math, and certainly Elon Musk does the math, figuring out there just isn't enough room for enough of these data centers. There isn't enough energy for these data centers, or there isn't enough cooling for that. So I know, let's just put thousands and thousands, ultimately 1 million of these satellites up in space. The sun always is shining, and it's nice and cool up there. So the two big issues with AI as well as some of the issues of regulation that would happen down here are maybe dealt with. So that's why you're starting to hear people like Elon Musk and maybe even Jeff Bezos eventually talking about what we're going to be doing in space with all these satellites.
Yeah, I mean, obviously AI is the big topic of the day.
Yeah.
What it can do. I mean, I saw the other day I saw a picture of my niece. It was a still photo that was AI made her dance. And just the amazing things that AI can do. Kind of scary sometimes, but it takes a lot of computing power. And again, you gotta cool those servers, you gotta cool those processors, and they're talking about different satellites will perform different functions for AI. One satellite will do the computing, another satellite might do the graphics processing or something, and so it's mind-boggling what SpaceX and XAI. They just merged.
They merged, yeah.
And so it's amazing what they're coming up with.
We're going to take a break, and let me just mention that maybe in the future I'll talk about some other articles I've got here because there's questions about cyber attacks, questions about whether or not the Russians want to try to steal some of the Starlink material, all sorts of things that I think are going to be part of international relations. But when we come back, I did want to spend some time talking about Day 4 astronomy because I wanted you to know about that, which is something that you can certainly be a part of. Also wanted to talk about Astronomy Day coming up March 5th. That's another opportunity for especially science-oriented children that you might have or grandchildren. Even if you're an adult, I think you'd appreciate that. So we're going to talk about all of those things. But if you'd like to join the conversation, we've been talking about space, talking about rockets, talking about satellites. If any of that's of interest to you, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. Parker Eng with me with Day 4. We'll come back and talk more about that right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about space, but in particular want to focus some on the ministry as well that you can be a part of if you'd like to do so. Can be talking about Day 4, going to talk about the Wonders Center, which is near Nashville. We have a link to that right now. Earlier this week, yesterday, we talked about the Discovery Institute event taking place this Saturday. You can go to discovery.org. You can go to wonderscenter.org. And, of course, you can go to day4.org. You don't have to remember all that. Simply just go to pointofview.net. It's all listed there. But Parker, we've been using the quote from Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, but how can we see how God's declaring the glory? What is the procedure that you're using right now in Day 4 to investigate all that? Again, the heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork.
Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. So what does that mean? What does it mean when it says the heavens declare the glory of God? How does it declare? What is it saying? And how do we know if we don't seek, if we don't search, if we don't look, if we don't do the research as Christians? And so that's what we're all about at Day 4 Astronomy, is looking at God's heavens from a biblical worldview, trying to see, is there something out there that God is trying to show us? See, the Bible says it is the glory of God to conceal things, to hide things, but it's the glory of kings to seek them out. And so we as God's children are here to seek that stuff out. And I think it's kind of a fun activity or game that God's put us on as His children to find the things that He's hidden out there, the things that confirm His Scripture, the things that show His intelligence and design. And so when we look at the heavens, not only is it declaring God's glory, but I believe it's declaring God's heart, because there is so much out there that shows us that it's impossible for us to be here without Him.
Yes.
There's so much out there that shows us His love for us and how He created things just so we could have not only life here on earth, but fellowship with Him. And it's funny. I think about this sometimes. Had Adam and Eve not fallen, had they not sinned that first sin, and if had we not, if we didn't sin the way we sin, God created everything before the fall of man. Why did He do that? Why did He create it the way He did? It's so cool to think about the fact that, one of these days when we're in heaven, we're going to be able to hop from galaxy to galaxy, from planet to planet, from star to star, to explore and do all that stuff in our new bodies. And I just love thinking about that because it's just exciting. I mean, I love space. I don't know anybody who doesn't have at least an interest in astronomy and in space, especially when there's fun stuff going on, whether it's a comet that's coming our way, or a total solar eclipse, or the aurora borealis, being able to see that. We've had some incredible opportunities lately to view the northern lights, even down as far as as Texas, which is rare. But I've seen them with my own eyes, even from my own backyard in Plano, Texas.
And I might just mention that, of course, one of the things you do is telescope workshops. And you think of the kind of telescopes that you have and many of your colleagues have. Galileo couldn't have imagined that. Isaac Newton couldn't imagine that. And so in some respects, just as we talked about even yesterday, this is almost kind of this golden age of apologetics and research. Really, it's almost the golden age of astronomy, because there is so much more that we have because of the Hubble telescope and the James Webb telescope, but our own telescopes and even, of course, going back to the moon. This is just a great evangelistic opportunity that you've discovered as well, isn't it?
Yeah. So we love using astronomy not only as a way to learn ourselves, but to use it as a platform for sharing the gospel. I can't tell you, when we set up telescopes in a public location and people see 2 and 3 dozen telescopes being set up outside, during the day, it gets their attention, and so our folks are ready to invite those people to come look. Our folks are ready to ask them, is there anything we can pray for them about? But really get to know them and see if there's any opportunities, find those opportunities to share the gospel with those folks.
One of the things that you have, and people can go to your website, Day 4, and that's day and then the number 4.org. But again, we have the link there. You have the 4 pillars of Day 4 astronomy. Before I take some questions about that, but because we'll have some people calling in, 800-351-1212. But what are some of the key pillars, and what is Day 4 all about?
So our 4 pillars are research, education, fellowship, and outreach. We start with research because we have to know what things look like out there, what the data tells us, and how do they how does that data match up with what Scripture says? The Bible is not necessarily a science book, but there's definitely things that we can deduct from reading Scripture and what it says and how it matches up with science. But once we figure out what it shows, then we got to teach people. We got to show people, what it says. And we do it with fellowship, and then we love getting together and doing star parties together, getting our telescopes out and seeing what the heavens look like, and then the outreach part of it, all very important. But we wrap all of that up in a big bow I call experience, because in the end, we want everybody to experience God every step of the way.
Yeah, and you've said before that it's one thing to see, for example, the rings of Saturn in a textbook. It's another to look in the eyepiece and see it on a telescope.
There is something magic about putting your eyeball up to an eyepiece of a telescope and having the photons of light, that's reflected off, from the sun to Saturn and then back through the telescope into your eye. There is just something about that when you actually see it, and it does. People tell me all the time, "Are you kidding me? That looks like it's in a textbook. Are you sure that's real?" and I'm like, "Yeah, that's real. That God created that out there, and it's for His glory, but it's also for our pleasure."
Well, let's take some phone calls along the way. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Parker Eng. Let's go to Pete out there in Texas. Pete, thank you for calling today.
Yes, sir. I want to talk a little bit about that magic he was talking about. There in Psalms 19, when it says that the creation speaks to you, well, not with the audible voice, but here's what I did. I went out there and got in the hood of a car, and I live out in the country where there's no lights at all. You got to do this where there's no lights at all. And I sat there in the hood, and I sat there for about 45 minutes, not thinking about anything else, just looking at the creation of God. All of a sudden, the whole creation began speaking, not in an audible voice, but all of a sudden, my mouth dropped, everything dropped, and the awness. I mean, it was so loud. I tell people all the time, try that, man. It might take you 30 minutes, 45 minutes. Just get out there where there's no lights, city lights, and just sit there and look at the creation of God, and all of a sudden, it will speak to you. I mean, not in an audible voice, but it will just, wow.
Very good. Again, we oftentimes talk about the fact we have so much light pollution that people don't have a chance to see that. But if you've ever been backpacking or out there in the country and you go, there are a lot more stars up there than I realized, and this is the Milky Way. And that's really what David and others were reflecting on in the Psalms, because you begin to realize how big the universe is and how small we are, which is why he asks another question in Psalm 8, who is man that thou art mindful of him? So in some respects, you can really begin to get a picture for the awesomeness of God and how God's creation really does speak to us.
That's right. Especially, we have these new instruments that are out there now called smart telescopes, and we can actually image nebulae and galaxies from even lightly light-polluted locations. I've got incredible pictures of the Horsehead Nebula, the Flame Nebula, and other. I took a picture of the Monkey Nebula the other day, and these are things that I was never able to take from Plano, Texas, a decade ago. Yeah. But now we have access to these wonderful tools to see what is out there, and it's so cool. But I agree with the caller to sit outside in a dark sky location. There's just something spiritual about that, and to be able to connect with God out there in His nature and looking up, and you can sense His love for us when you're out there doing that.
Going to take a break. When we come back, do want to talk about Astronomy Day, which is taking place at the Wonders Center, which for those of you, especially in Tennessee, are something you could attend, but are there other ways that you can watch it as well? I know Parker's going to be doing a lot of planetarium presentations there. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Parker Eng in studio today, president and founder of Day 4. You can go to day4.org. You can also go to thewonderscenter.org, but you don't need to know all that because we have that information on our website. But Parker, I thought for just a minute we would point out the fact that in a little bit of time, and people can actually plan for this a little easier, there will be a Day 4 astronomy event that you do, but there's also an astronomy day that takes place at the Wonder Center, so they can click on your picture to find out the one for Day 4. They can click on the other one that says Astronomy Day, and that is something taking place at the Wonder Center, which is just a little bit west of Nashville, and that is a phenomenal facility, and you're going to actually be doing some of the planetarium presentations.
That's right. So my good buddy David Reeves has a ministry there. He's got this incredible museum. The building actually is probably, I think it's the world's largest creation museum, and he's got a large planetarium. I think it seats 140-something people, and I'll be doing a couple planetarium presentations in there, and which is going to be a lot of fun, talking about finding the glory of God in the heavens and how we do that. And I'll be talking about some research that we're working on about novas. And we've got our Day 4 crew. Some of our volunteers are going to be there at the Day 4 booth. But David has a number of PhD scientists that will be doing some special presentations there. We have a 10th grader named Sonny James, who is a big part of our ministry, that will be doing a couple presentations about the many moons in our solar system. And that presentation is going to be geared more for kids, but I think it'll be fun for adults as well. And we've got Nick Rodriguez, who's going to be playing the role of Rocket Man in that presentation. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We got prizes and other things. But again, David's facility there at the Wonder Center in Dixon, Tennessee, is incredible. And you'll definitely want to come out for Astronomy Day, and then the star party that we're going to do afterwards. We're going to bring out the telescopes, the big guns, and take a look at what we can see from Dixon, Tennessee.
So even if you can't attend it, you might go to the website and find out more, because lots of times they'll post some of the videos and things of that nature. As we mentioned with the Discovery Institute, you can actually watch that live. So there are some great opportunities over the next couple of weeks here to have some great Christian-based scientific investigation, and we need more and more of that all the time. And I think in some respects, Parker, you have really fit a niche, because yes, we do have some great ministries that are focused on creation, the Institute for Creation Research, Answers in Genesis. I go through the list. People are very familiar with that. But oftentimes the one that doesn't get as much mention is astronomy. And yet, of course, ICR has a planetarium and the Wonder Center has one, but you've really dug into it, gotten to know some of these other people that are creationist scientists who are really working in this area. And I think this is a real key niche that you've been able to fill. So how can people get involved with you? Because I think there's a place where you could have a Day 4 chapter at your Christian school. You could have a Day 4 chapter at your church. You could be involved with that in some way. I know you're looking for land that you might even use to find some dark sky sites. So talk about all the ways people can plug into Day 4.
Yeah, so, I love ministries like ICR, in the Institute for Creation Research, and Answers in Genesis, AIG, and the like. But the difference between those ministries and our ministry is that we are a fellowship ministry. We want you to learn how to do astronomy as a Christian. We want you to learn yourself what it means to see the glory of God in the heavens, and we want you to learn how to show other people the same. And so we're a fellowship ministry. We want to start chapters. Our goal is to blanket the country eventually with chapters of Day 4 astronomy all over different churches, different Christian private schools, different homeschool groups. And so if you want to start a chapter of Day 4 astronomy, just simply email me at info@day4.org. and we can get things going and get you on the right path to doing that, and we'll be there to support you and help you with that endeavor. But it is so fun to be able to do astronomy together, and there's so many different aspects of astronomy. Again, telescopes and the toys that we get to play with, and the things that we get to see in the heavens with those toys.
Well, again, some of the technology that if you've never seen it before, I think you do have some places where people can watch that, because you'll hook up one of your telescopes by using the various star patterns, and then you'll type in Andromeda. It just goes over there. Or, the Monkey Galaxy. And it will go automatically to those places. And then you have some that will almost like do a time exposure, so that some of the things that are almost not visible to the naked eye, you can get some incredible astrophotography, can't you?
Yes, and we display those on digital screens at the star parties, but also the manual telescopes. What you're talking about are the newer smart telescopes, and we love those and all the different toys. And yes, we are looking for different Christians who own land in dark sky locations, because our goal is to set up either agreements with or have some different landowners donate, maybe a 10-acre tract out of their 1,000 acres or whatever, and so that we can put little concrete pads on that spot, so that we can actually set up our telescopes there and give access to Day 4 members to go out there with their families to do astronomy. To have what we call a Messier marathon, throughout the night, where there's 110 different objects in the Messier catalog, and the goal is to try to see every single one of those throughout one night, 1 or 2 nights, and it's a lot of fun. There's different activities that we can do and different goals that we have in viewing the night sky, and so. We're calling upon different Christian landowners to see if they'd be willing to do that, but also donors. It is crucial for us to raise money and funds so that we can spread this ministry and get it in every nook and cranny of Christian churches and private schools and homeschool groups. It takes resources to do that.
And again, so you want to equip individuals so they can do it on their own, but I think you'd be available occasionally to come and speak to a group or something of that nature, get something set up, because I think the first key, as we mentioned just a minute ago, is info@day4.org. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to look a little bit more about this astronomy day, I'd like to know more about Day 4, I'd like to know a little bit more about Artemis 2, even the whole idea of all these satellites in space, we have posted a numerous number of articles that you can find at the website today, pointofview.net. And Parker, when I started hearing about all the things that are happening with the idea of launching towards the moon and putting satellites in space, and then, of course, all the things you're doing with Day 4, I wanted to bring you in, and I'm glad you came and joined us today.
Thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'm so blessed to have you as one of my best friends, and so thank you for all that you do for me, but for everybody else too.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will get into all sorts of issues. You have heard me yesterday talk about the importance of you saying you wanted to support the SAVE Act, which is, again, the idea of election integrity. SAVE stands for Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility. We talked about that yesterday. If it doesn't make sense you should have a photo ID before you vote, I think so, and this is something that is right before the United States Senate, so if you haven't taken action or take action, items are there. My viewpoints, commentaries there, and all sorts of articles about space and astronomy are on the website. We'll take a break. We have more to cover right after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Mark sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of issues in the news. Of course, right off the bat, State of the Union address tonight. I don't know whether you will watch it or not, but we will certainly have some coverage of it tomorrow. The reason we have a State of the Union address, it turns out that that's actually in the Constitution, and that is Article 2, Section 3, requires that from time to time the President shall give a report to Congress about the State of the Union. Now, that first message was given by George Washington in New York City. Why New York City? Well, we hadn't actually developed the Washington, D.C. area, so that speech was one which originally he was going to lay out some of his legislative priorities and was actually talked out of that, so it was more of a general speech. But then you go to John Adams, who, of course, did deliver that in Congress, and then to Thomas Jefferson, who said, wait a minute, this really could just be delivered as a letter or a document on the State of the Union. And so he says, we don't need all this pomp and ceremony. He was saying that back there in the early part of the 19th century. So that tells you something right there. So we will just deliver a printed document of the State of the Union. It can be read by the Sergeant at Arms or the Speaker of the House or whatever, and that will fulfill the requirement in the Constitution. And that tradition continued on through the 19th century until 1913, when Woodrow Wilson said, "You wait a minute, this is a missed opportunity." And so what we will do now is we will actually deliver it in front of a joint session of Congress. And that is certainly the case. The first president to deliver the State of the Union address on radio was Calvin Coolidge, of all people, who may be one of the more humble of our presidents, but nevertheless delivered it there. Of course, later television changed everything, especially with John F. Kennedy, a very telegenic individual, and then going on to probably one of the most telegenic of individuals in the modern era. That was of Ronald Reagan, who also instituted something else, which will be playing out tonight, and that is to actually have people sitting in the gallery there in Congress and to turn it into almost a Hollywood production. After all, Ronald Reagan was an actor before he was president of the United States. And so the theatrics sometimes work fairly well. Sometimes they fall flat. We will see. And as we were saying even before the program this hour started, when you look at such things as the Academy Awards, they pay attention to what everybody was wearing. When you talk about the State of the Union address, a lot of people will pay attention to who stood, who didn't stand, who who booed. There has been, I think, a bad tradition, and I will say Republicans have been as guilty, perhaps more so than even the Democrats, of booing a couple of individuals, Joe Biden and others. But nevertheless, here's where we are, and we will see how it unfolds tonight. One of the things I thought I'd mention before we move on is the Reuters poll was interesting because they've asked Americans, do you think President Trump has become more erratic as he ages? And 61% say that is the case. Actually, again, it breaks down on partisan lines. 89% of Democrats, 30% of Republicans, 64% of independents. And again, I would say to my fellow Republicans, let's be honest, just as Democrats and many people in the media would not acknowledge that certainly Joe Biden has lost a step, I think it would be incumbent upon Republicans to acknowledge that there is a sort of erratic behavior sometimes of Donald Trump. And nevertheless, the bigger issue, which is one I hope they will discuss tomorrow, is the poll really showed this, that most Americans, apart from the question of Donald Trump, believe that the country's political leadership is generally too old. That I thought was interesting. 79% of the polls, people responded that elected officials in Washington, D.C. are too old to represent most Americans. The average age in the United States Senate is 64. The average age in the House of Representatives is 58. And the only reason it looks that good, if you will, is because we do have a couple of younger members. But you think of Donald Trump, 79 years of age. You think of course, now Nancy Pelosi stepping down. You have Chuck Schumer. I mean, you have a lot of older people in Congress. And that, I think, is an issue that perhaps tomorrow's Next Generation Roundtable she'll maybe have a chance to discuss. Before we get to some of the issues in the news, I am going to be quoting a little bit later from Charles Cook, but I found this one just came out today in which he was saying our men's hockey team's historic win was just too much for sports writers to bear. What he's talking about here is, he says, permit me, if I can offer by humble counter-argument. He says, in my estimation, Eileen Gu is a mercenary sports trader who ought to be muttered about darkly, whereas the U.S. men's hockey team is chock full of awesome, fun-loving, patriotic champions who deserve every last drop of their newfound national attention. Because the point he's making is to read some of these sports writers, this individual who is actually Chinese but lives in San Francisco, goes to Stanford, but actually was a skier for the Chinese, is something that we should put on a pedestal, according to the sports writers. And the men's hockey team is something that we should be embarrassed about. And he says the charge against the men's team seems to be fourfold. First, having won the gold, its members declined to address the tide of fascism in the United States and said such gauche, hyper-nationalistic things like, this is all about our country right now. I love the USA. I'm proud to be an American. This is for every American. This is the greatest country in the world, which to me sounds pretty good, but apparently for the sports writers is just too much to bear. Then talks about some of the other comments there, whether it's a statement by President on the phone call, the FBI Director Kash Patel, or whatever it might be. But he says, look, journalists are not politicians, and there's no need for them to be perfectly representative of the nation. But it might be a good thing for our culture that they weren't all a bunch of massive weirdos, he says. If you were to stop 100 people on the street at random and ask them about USA's victory on Sunday, how many do you think would fixate on the supposed jingoism of the nation, or on President Trump's phone call, or on Kash Patel? Instead, they would be celebrating that both the women's hockey team and the men's hockey team won, as well as all the other great stories out of the Olympics. So if nothing else, just wanted to acknowledge that the sports writers just felt the need to run the men's hockey team into the dirt while lauding the accomplishments of some of the individuals that actually decided to turn their back on their own host country and ski for another country. They're free to do whatever they want, but sometimes wouldn't it be better if some of these journalists weren't just a bunch of massive weirdos? Great line, Charlie Cook. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
During a hearing in the U.S. House of Representatives, we learned more about potential threats to America, but those threats differed based upon the political party of the member of Congress. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government focused on the influence of Sharia and is chaired by Representative Chip Roy. He also put together a Sharia-free American caucus that now includes 38 members from 18 states. One of the witnesses was Robert Spencer, who has written extensively about the threat from radical Islam. In the hearing, he provided examples of how Sharia policies have been implemented in the UK. In that country, Sharia courts have collided with British judicial system. The response from many of the Democratic members of the subcommittee was to label the discussion unnecessary. Instead, they decided to pivot the discussion to what they believe is a threat to America: Christian nationalism. Representative Brandon Gill cited surveys showing that 39% of Muslims believe that Sharia law should be implemented in this country. He cited another poll that showed the nearly same percentage believe Islam should be declared as the national religion. These statistics were met with snickers from Democrats on the committee. Representative Glenn Grothman said he often interacts with conservative Christian groups in the Midwest and has yet to find one person who is a self-avowed or even an unself-avowed Christian nationalist. He went on to say that Democrats keep talking about these mystery people. This hearing once again illustrates that we may live in the same country, but the members of those political parties live in different worlds. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, of course, the President's going to be speaking tonight on the State of the Union address. There will be a response. And, of course, we'll cover some of it tomorrow. But one of the articles I've posted for you to read comes from Charles Cook. I just quoted from him a minute ago, but this one is, I think, very important. He says, we need a vote on Iran. Now, if you've listened to our program on Friday, we spent some time talking about the fact that we seem as a country to be gearing up to try to force Iran to do a number of very positive things, and the implications are we wouldn't have put that much in terms of military buildup if we weren't planning on some kind of military action. Now, it does seem to me that there are always times in which a very significant discussion needs to take place before military action. You saw that with George Herbert Walker Bush. You saw that with George W. Bush in terms of what happened there in Iraq. Before we do any kind of military action against Iran, that is the case. Now, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution requires Congress to declare war. Well, we haven't done that since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It takes you all the way back to 1941, which is a sad commentary because it does seem to me that we have had all sorts of military actions since then. And so whether it was Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, eventually by 1973, we got what was called the War Powers Act, which says, okay, we'll still give the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, freedom to engage in military action, but that is limited, and there is a need, if they do engage in military action, to report back to Congress. I think you could make the case, I'll leave this for a discussion in a future program, as to whether or not the War Powers Act is even constitutional. It was enacted at a time when Richard Nixon was at his weakest. He could not really justify vetoing it. It's after we have the Vietnam War. Of course, none of that was anticipating war on terrorism and the rest, but even under George W. Bush, you had this authorization for military action. And we are gearing up with enough military personnel and enough equipment and enough of armaments that we are essentially almost equal to what was happening in our war on terror. So it does seem to me that that would make some sense. But here's some of the things that Charles Cook says. He says, look, I'm of the view that absent congressional authorization, it is unconstitutional for the president to make a substantive, non-defensive change to American foreign policy. By design, the war-making powers lie with the legislature. Just told you that. And what is currently being mooted by the Trump administration is closer to a declaration of war than to any of the semantic alternatives. He says, at a push, one could characterize last year's strikes on Iran's enrichment facilities as a responsive act on the grounds the United States had limited time to prevent the acquisition of a nuclear weapon and that legislative debate was therefore impossible. Okay, but that's a bit. He says it is true, no doubt, that Iran is an adversary of the United States and that Iran is seeking to obtain weapons that the United States does not wish it to have, and that in various places around the world, Iran is directly or indirectly involved in attacks on American personnel. He says, perhaps you dissent, he says, from my legal view. That's fine. Many do, including some I admire, and he gives you kind of a list of some of the people that don't agree with his position. But he says, the Constitution aside, would it not, as a matter of elementary political hygiene, be better for a decision of this magnitude to be made out in the open rather than behind closed doors? If President Trump decides to go into Iran, that decision will be permanent. It is an instant. We will all be committed to the course with the only opportunity to push back coming after the fact. He says, Donald Trump is most famous is that the United States should not get involved in any more conflicts of choice in the Middle East. If that is changed, the change ought to be accounted for, and not implicitly by means of an order that is reported ex nihilo on CNN, but explicitly over the course of a number of days with the eyes of voters trained on its advocates. He will have to make the case tonight, and if he does not, then I think you can make even more of the case for Congress to begin to step in. And so we'll see how it unfolds. But I wanted you to hear from him. There are others that are thinking, no, the president has the authority to actually engage in military action. But this buildup is something akin to what we already have seen when our two different Bush presidents decided to engage first in removing Saddam Hussein and then, of course, in engaging the war on terror. But nevertheless, that is a piece that I wanted you to read, and I think Charles Cook does a pretty good job of describing that as well. Just before we take a break, I'm going to talk about media bias, and in particular, we'll pick on Apple News. Tomorrow, Liberty McCarter is going to spend a little bit of time talking about cell phones and smartphones and social media and the rest. But Douglas Murray, who is an individual who's really been writing a lot about Islam and a number of other things, took time to write about something else. He says, remember that time before the 2020 election when everybody was focused on social media election interference? And, of course, he talks about some of the things that were happening and, of course, how Elon Musk bought Twitter. And he says because everyone knew that Twitter, like the dumpster fire called Wikipedia, was insanely politically partisan. Well, then he goes on and says, well, now take Apple for an example. For months, I've been wondering why Apple keeps pushing me stories I have absolutely no interest or desire to read. Why does it keep offering me stories from The Guardian, BBC, and other left-wing news sites? Because he's British, you obviously are going to get some of those. Why does Apple keep pushing stories from left-leaning news sites? And then he goes through AP, Huntington Post, all the rest. And he says, look, it's not just that I'm having this experience. There was a study that was out. The study showed that out of the 166 articles pushed by Apple News over a 2-week period, exactly half came from left-leaning outlets. But then, come now to January 2026, Apple's top stories consisted of 620 stories from left-leaning and other news sources. Exactly 0 stories came from any other outlet that could be described as right-leaning. So Apple News is giving you only one side of the picture. Apple, again, never seems to offer any stories, he says, from right-leaning news sites. What a funny coincidence, he says. Of course, he's having some fun there. He's on to say, consider the way in which the story of the Minnesota Somali fraud scandal turned out. For a few days, everyone was focused on it. Governor Tim Walz and others seemed to be under some genuine political pressure for allowing such a fraud on a gargantuan scale to take place. Then suddenly the story was all about ICE. And every other news story pushed out was how horrible ICE was. And he goes into the detail, and you know that only so well. And so, again, he said, over time, I felt like I was being manipulated. Gone was the fraud scandal because now we could focus on the ICE scandal. And if you think that was a coincidence or that was just timing, you know only so well that there was a deliberate bias even in the kind of news being promoted and then, of course, continued pushed out by Apple. Well, over time, some of these studies coming out, not the least of which is 620 stories by Apple News and not one of them coming for White Wing. Well, occasionally, he says, when a company like Apple is shamed for this, they try to find a quick correction. Last week, Apple chose to push one story from Fox News. And it was the tragic death of Dawson's Creek actor James Van Der Beek. But this is hardly a story that has a political slant to it. But they did it because, of course, now we can show that we occasionally do pull one story out of Fox News while all the others are from left-leaning. And, of course, you can see that it was an attempt to try to make it look a little less biased, even though it really was. And so he points out that the midterms are likely to be decided by voters' attitudes towards the economy and the cost of living. And I think you have a pretty good idea of all sorts of stories that will be coming out. And again, they will come from Apple News and all sorts of other stories that even if we've been able to reduce costs, and there's pretty good evidence, I'll talk about this in just a minute, that we may be headed in an economy for deflation rather than inflation due to AI. You probably won't hear a lot about that from some of the left-leaning news organizations. But when we come back, we're going to talk about this changing world order, some of the changing economic issues, and we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here, from Kerby and the team at Point of View. We need your support, please. Join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, just for a few minutes, I thought we might talk about this rather dramatic announcement that comes from Ray Dalio. You might say, okay, who's Ray Dalio? He's a hedge fund manager, was the founder of Bridgewater Associates. But even though he's been a hedge fund manager, he's really kind of turned into an economic historian. For some of you that are watching online, let me hold up a book by him, by Ray Dalio, which has the title Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. For those of you looking at it right now, you'll see it's a 550-page book. It's pretty extensive, to put it mildly. Have I looked at every page? Yes. Have I read every page? No. Although I am thinking that it's something that we might want to talk about in the future. And we're going to talk about a shorter version of this because he just posted a piece on X which says it's official, the world order has broken down. Now, he wrote that book 5 years ago about the changing world order. His latest one has this title, How Countries Go Broke, the Big Cycle. But he's basing a lot of this on the fact that there are cycles in history. If you find that being similar, one of the resources we've made available to you in the past, and this is one of the many benefits of being a Truth Team member, is we send out these booklets every single month. This particular one came out a little over a year ago. And it's entitled A Biblical Point of View on Historical Cycles. And this is still available, I believe, on a PDF format. You can go to the website, pointofview.net. You can scroll to the bottom, and you will see there's a search engine there, and you could type in historical cycles. You get a PDF of it. But again, we're going to probably update it because one of the things I did a while back is I did a teaching, you might remember, on why empires fail, and I may pull some of the material from Ray Dalio and put it in with some of the books that we had that were written by Victor Davis Hanson and also by Johan Norberg and others, and Cal Thomas and some of the other people that wrote about this. What is he writing about? Well, he's pointing out the fact that we are in a time in which the old order is breaking down. You might say, well, okay, he's a hedge fund manager. What does he know about the world? Well, actually quite a bit, but let me give you a few other quotes, because at the Munich Security Council conference, this is where we mentioned the fact that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was speaking. You had the German Chancellor say, quote, "The world order as it has stood for decades no longer exists." Wow. The French president agreed and said Europe's old security structures tied to the previous world order don't exist, and really Europe needs to prepare for war. That was a bit over the top, but Macron was always tending to talk that way. And you had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who's talked about the fact that we're in this, if you will, new geopolitical era because the old world is gone. If you go to, for example, not the Munich Security Conference, but you went maybe to the World Economic Forum, we talked about that a few weeks ago, they're also talking about this world order has broken down. What is he talking about? He's been watching and looking at many of these different cycles in history. I'll hold up our booklet again on that. And you've certainly seen this in the economic issues. In my booklet, for example, I talk about some of the political cycles or cultural cycles that we've had over the years. We, of course, have a generational cycle. When you hear people talking about the fourth turning, obviously that's what they're getting at. There's a technological cycle, but there's also an economic cycle. He tends to look primarily at the economic cycles, but that economic cycle or the financial cycle can be seen in his books or even in my booklet here. I talk about what was the dominant currency? Well, in the 15th century, the dominant currency was Portugal, the Portuguese real. And then later on, Spain, the Spanish real in the 16th century. What about the 17th century? Well, the dominant currency there was the Netherlands, and the Dutch guilder. And then in the 18th century, probably the most dominant, partially because of, people like Napoleon and others, the French franc. In the 19th century, certainly the British pound. And in the 20th century and part of now the 21st century, it's been the U.S. dollar. Is that going to continue? Probably not. And so what is he actually describing in terms of these cycles? Well, he's talking about these very significant fights that take place. We have cycles within a country, and those are sometimes resolved because of the structure of the country. But outside of the countries, the problem with it is we really don't have any agreed upon laws. Oh, yes, we have a United Nations. How effective has that been? And we have an International Monetary Fund. How's effective that been? Law enforcement. Oh, well, the biggest country in the world, the United States, has to try to bring some kind of order. How do we adjudicate that? Well, we have, of course, the World Court, but, be serious. And so as a result, you have these, what he calls wars. Now, the last one is a shooting war, but the others, first of all, is a trade economic war. That's a conflict over tariffs. I could hold up an article right now that we'll get to later in the week about whether or not the latest tariffs that have been implemented by Donald Trump are legal or constitutional, but tariffs, import, export restrictions, all that. Number two, we then have a technology war. Those are conflicts over technologies which are shared, the whole issue of national security. Then we oftentimes have geopolitical wars over territories and alliances. Wouldn't it be better if the United States owned Greenland? Wouldn't it be better if we were to maybe have authority over some of these islands in the Caribbean? Isn't it maybe important for us to remove the leader in, say, Venezuela? You get the idea. Then we have the capital wars, sanctions. Oh, yes, we had sanctions on Russia. Russia is fighting a war against Ukraine, but we then had sanctions against Iran, of course. But we actually cut off all sorts of funding for Russia. And so he says eventually these lead to what? Military wars. And so as a result, we've had these first four really taking place. We're in the midst of some of the capital wars and even some of those geopolitical wars, but eventually some of those wars involve shooting. And his argument is really simple. We've experienced these first four. We're starting to move into the fifth one, and he says conflict oftentimes arises when the dominant power begins to weaken or an emerging power begins to approach it in strength, or both. And so we can begin to see that in some respects we are seeing, if you will, a decline of the United States and a rise of China. The argument used to be that it would be a decline of the United States and a rise of Japan. Does anybody seriously believe that any longer? Not really. But nevertheless, is China ready to take center stage? Maybe, maybe not. But I think it raises a very fundamental question, and it illustrates again that if we're really serious about our country remaining the dominant superpower, we're going to have to get our house in order. So after the break, I want to talk about what are the options to trying to get our economic house in order, which brings us to the book he published last year, How Countries Go Broke. Because we have seen how some of those countries which were at their very pinnacle actually fell apart. And you might remember when I did my teaching a few days ago on why empires fall. It's still available on the website if you'd like to get it. But just remember, back in 1590, Spain was the richest empire in the world, controlled half of the world's gold and silver. The Spain's military dominated Europe, yet within 80 years, Spain's government was bankrupt. 1590, then you go to when the British Empire was the largest empire in the world. There was never a time when the sun set on the British Empire, but after World War I, a terrible cost. By the end of World War II, no longer a dominant power. And the Soviet Union, even as late as 1991, seemed dominant, yet 900 days later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Let us hope that it is not the story of the United States. When we come back, we have to recognize some of the choices that the United States needs to make. And in a sense, many of those doors are closed. And so we want to talk about that because if nothing else, we're living through this time in history. We're living through a time in which there might be a great golden age on the offing, but we have to address some very important issues at a time when we're so politically divided. If you needed any reminder of that, just watch the State of the Union address tonight. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, but let's just for a minute talk about what this country might need to do. And I recognize that sometimes these are big issues. I've oftentimes said that for every person worried about the end of the world, there are 1,000 people worried about the end of the month. But if you don't pay attention to what's happening in the U.S. economy, what's happening in the global economy, sooner or later, it is going to affect you and your family. So I thought for just a minute we might talk about that. And in Chapter 3 of his book, The Changing World Order, he goes through some of the various options that a country dealing with the debt cycle that he talks about in his more recent book about how countries go broke, why there are very few options and why those options don't work very well. But rather than using Ray Dalio, I thought I'd use an illustration that James Lavish uses. I met him at a Bitcoin conference recently. He's an individual involving in investments, but he has this framework about the 4 doors. And I'm always looking for ways to take some of the complex economic and philosophical stuff and make it simple. So here it is. Door number 1 has on it austerity. In other words, we need to cut costs, and we need to live within our budget. It's politically impossible because I think even Ray Dalio, and I've quoted him before, and James Lavish and others point out, and you know this, neither party really wants to cut spending enough to really matter. We tried a thing called DOGE. How's that working out for you? The Department of Government Efficiency. We have been running $2 trillion deficits. The cuts aren't coming. The only way that we reduce the deficits are by actually getting more tariff revenue, but we'll see where that goes because we just had the Supreme Court rule about tariffs on Friday. But that's door number 1, austerity. Is that going to happen? Let's get real. Door number 2, raise taxes. Okay, that's the solution that you get from some of the members of Congress, but it's also politically toxic. For all the comment about raising the taxes on some, we talked about this yesterday in terms of the mayor of New York City. There's really a silly ceiling on how much you can really cut or raise taxes, I should say, a ceiling on how much revenue you can extract before you start killing productivity. And we already have seen what happens. Rich people leave. We've already talked about people leaving California. We yesterday talked with Kevin McCullough about people in New York City that never thought they would leave, and now some of them are leaving as well. Wealthy people are flooding into places like Texas and Florida and Nevada. Why? Because there's no income tax in those places. But you really don't have the ability to tax your way out of the debt problem. As much as some individuals love to talk about taxing the wealthy, the reality is we're talking about $38 trillion in national debt, folks. Let's get real. Even if you could take every possible penny of some of the people we just mentioned, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others, that's just still not enough. It just won't work. And of course, they would certainly, long before you would take all of their wealth, go somewhere else or just simply stop working. Okay, austerity, raise taxes. Door number 3, default. The reality is a number of countries actually have done that. You could just refuse to pay your debts. You could reset everything. And you could even begin to reset and denominate your debt in a different currency. Sort of done by Franklin Delano Roosevelt back in the 1930s, where he confiscated all the gold. Once he got all the gold, then he changed the value of the gold. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense either, because after all, if you can control the printing press, you can do door number 4, and that is to start printing money. And what you end up doing is, it's really the only door that's open. The door for austerity, it's locked. The door for raising taxes, it's pretty much jammed shut. It can be opened a little bit, but it's pretty much locked. Default, probably not. It's really locked. There's only one door that's actually open, and that's to print money. Well, you've heard me talk about the fact that there is a book out there by Lawrence Lepard calling The Big Print. Just as we had The Big Short, we have now The Big Print. It's not really a policy choice. It's the only option really left after the other 3, and so it's door number 4. Well, if we start printing money again, or start increasing the money supply in all sorts of ways, because you can do that by more than just printing the money. You can do that by fractional reserves and banking. You can do that perhaps even with some of the things they're doing right now with stable coins and all the rest. Whatever it means and however it's done, the reality is the dollars in your pocket, the dollars in your wallet, the dollars in your purse, worth less. If you're living day to day off of your paycheck, that hurts you more than it hurts anybody else. Individuals that have assets, this could be land, could be stocks, could be all sorts of things, could be Bitcoin, I've certainly mentioned that before, those assets eventually appreciate. Even though some of those are actually low right now, you can kind of see what's going to happen in the future. But the harsh reality is, this is why, again, Ray Dalio talks about why countries go broke, because the reality is 3 of those doors are essentially locked. The only one left leads to inflation. And they may not have had printing presses back in Rome. They just knocked off pieces of it, or they remelted the coins and put less silver in the coins, more copper in the coins. You know how it goes, and we, of course, talked about that many times here on Point of View. So this is where we find ourselves right now, but for those of you that say, I'm glad you got those very significant books, not a chance I'm going to read them, you might at least want to read the first couple of pages of this piece that appeared in X, which formerly was known as Twitter. It's official. The world order has broken down, and it illustrates why the president and other leaders in other countries are doing what they're doing right now. Maybe gives you a preview of what they might be doing in the future. Those are the kinds of things we talk about here on Point of View. Let me mention that my commentary today is about threats to America, which also illustrates how divided this country is. Had a House of Representatives subcommittee meeting on the threat to America, primarily Sharia law. This was put together by Chip Roy, who chaired the subcommittee and actually has put together a Sharia-Free America caucus that includes 38 members from 18 states. And whether you think Sharia law is a big threat or not, almost all the Democratic members in the House subcommittee said Sharia law is not a threat. The real threat is Christian nationalism. And it's really hard to even put together a country, because even though we all live in the same country, members of political parties live in entirely different worlds. I'll be the first to admit that Sharia law maybe isn't all the threat some people make it out to be, but I'll guarantee you this idea of Christian nationalism as being a threat, please. But it illustrates again, and it will be illustrated tonight at the State of the Union address. You can watch who stands up, who sits down, who cheers, who boos, and it illustrates again, It's hard to pull a country together, even on something as simple as winning some of the games in the Olympics. And this is why we need to pray for our leaders and pray for this country. That's all we have for today. I think you will appreciate the conversation tomorrow as we have our Next Generation Roundtable. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. If you'd like to read some of the articles we've posted, we have them available right now on the website, pointofview.net. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.